Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Phil at the Movies. I'm your host, Phil Walsh, and this is episode number 118 of this ongoing podcast that is for the love of movies. I want to thank you, as always, for tuning in and hearing what I have to say on movies and cinema alike. And I know I'm a day late, but happy 4th of July, happy Independence Day to all of my friends and listeners here in the USA, and to everyone else across the globe. Welcome back to another episode and happy summer. Now, today I'm going to be talking with you about a film that was on my radar for the longest time, but because of scheduling and because of a lack of a real definitive time that I could find at a theater near me, I finally just had a chance to see this film, and it is one of the most talked about slasher films in recent memory, and it's certainly generating a lot of discussion and discourse. Critical reaction to this film is relatively strong. Audience reaction is much more mixed to negative. And the film is in a violent nature. This is a slasher film about a killer that stalks a group of teenagers in the woods. Now, the premise seems very familiar. You could think of a Friday the 13th film as an example. It's similar ground covered that way. The difference with this film, unlike the Friday the 13th films, which this film is clearly a love letter to that franchise and to those series of films, which is a plus in its favor. But the switch in this particular story is the point of view is through the eyes of the killer Johnny. So think of watching a Halloween film or a Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street, and we're just watching it through the point of view of the killer, Jason, Freddy, or Michael. I guess I should put Freddy to the side since he actually is a talkative character. But imagine watching a Friday the 13th film through the point of view of Jason, a character that doesn't talk. He just walks around the woods and kills people. That is what this film is about. And I know I'm a little generalizing here, but that is the basic takeaway. It's a much more cerebral kind of slasher film. There's an art house feel to it. I think of a lot of A24 horror films. It's very much if A24 made Friday the 13th. You've got the sort of unique spin on a horror character. You've got a monologue at the very end, which I will comment on. And then you have a few over the top kills, which are right in the wheelhouse of a Friday the 13th film. So there's a lot of ideas going around here, but it's really the execution that I think is the biggest problem, and no pun intended, of course, when I say that. But I will be talking a few spoilers, so if you have not seen the film and you want to savor the experience, this would be a great time to unplug, step away from the podcast, go have a drink or enjoy a barbecue, and come back after you've seen the film if you wish. But putting that all aside, let me tell you my thoughts on this film because normally on this show, I wouldn't say 100% of the time, but near that, I generally talk about films that I really enjoy and have a great experience with or connect with on some level or have a great impact with me in a viewing experience. And this is one of those films where I I went into it thinking, okay, I love slasher films. I love unique takes on the genre. Let's see what this has to offer. And I can't say it is a bad film because there is a unique point of view. And by that, I'm meaning with what the writer director was trying to go for with putting us in the point of view of the killer, sort of offering an interesting commentary, point of view, if you will, on the nature of evil and almost sort of equating the killer Johnny to being that of a wild animal and sort of having animalistic instincts and no ability for self-control. Again, a lot of interesting themes going on. And I think putting the audience in the point of view of a killer is kind of a fun way to take the genre. It's something that we really haven't seen before. But ultimately, as with any movie, it's about the execution. And in this particular one, great idea, great setup, great premise, but horrible, horrible, horrible execution. And I think that's why this film is not landing as well with audiences, because they go in thinking we're going to see something more. And I'm not saying you can't reinvent the wheel or try something different with a slasher film, because I think the formula is well worn at this point, and so there's not much you can do in terms of reinvention. But at the same time, props for trying to pursue a different outlet. And I think maybe a stronger rewrite, or perhaps even a character that spoke and we had more of an internal monologue with, might be interesting. But when a character is mute and just stalks through the woods, there's not much for characterization or even point of view other than just the character is walking through the woods. And I've seen on social media that has been a point of contention with people, that essentially this movie is 90 minutes of a character walking through the woods and then a few splatter kills here and there. And yes, that is the case. A lot of this movie is the character of Johnny walking through the woods in the daytime and at the night. That does happen, but I think sometimes people are being a little bit over dramatic, because that is the whole point. That's what this movie is going for. It's trying to put us in the world, the mindset of this killer. And if you look at a Friday the 13th film, for example, the character of Jason pops up when something has to happen. You might get a few moments here and there of the character walking around, but largely the story is focused on the teenaged victims at the campground or people in the woods together. They are the ones driving the story, and Jason just sort of pops up when somebody has to die or there needs to be a chase scene. And in this particular case, we're getting the reversal. Interestingly enough, when the teenage characters do appear on screen, they only talk when Jason, when Johnny is in earshot. So it's not like they're dictating the story. In a lot of ways, the story is dictating to them. And so everything that happens vis-a-vis their conversations or dialogue is within the earshot of Johnny. He's always on the periphery, and we're watching, if you will, how Jason would be. Again, I know I'm sort of drawing on the Friday the 13th references, but there are a lot of nods to that particular franchise in this film. Most intentionally, perhaps, is the character of a woman who's driving the truck. She's never given a name in the film, but she's played by Lauren Marie Taylor, and horror fans will know her from Friday the 13th, Part 2. She played the character Vicky. So there is sort of a little in-world reference, if you will, or nod to the genre, which I can certainly appreciate those kind of Easter eggs. But certainly, in addition to that, there is a little bit of exposition going on in the film with the character of Johnny and a long lost connection to his mother, and even his sort of quote resurrection, if you will, that happens in the movie. It's very much in the vibe and tradition of a Friday the 13th film. Even the way he looks, the design and the aesthetic of his clothes, and even the choice of mask, it does feel like this is a tribute, if you will, not a copy, but a tribute to the Friday the 13th, and of course to Jason. But as I said, much of the film is spent with us just watching this character stalk and walk through the woods. At some points aimlessly, but there seems to be almost a randomness to his nature. Again, it's trying to put us in the mindset of how would a Jason Voorhees be acting if the movie was put on his character the entire time. And I think we now have the answer to that with this film, In a Violent Nature. And I think that is the limits of those kinds of stories. I'm not saying it can't be done effectively, but you are limited when a character cannot talk or doesn't talk, and their only reaction is pretty much to stalk or kill any number of characters. And that seems to be the biggest takeaway from this film. In addition, one of the moments that is generating a lot of discussion, a lot of reaction, is this kill that happens about probably 30 minutes or so into the film, and it's been referred to as the yoga kill. I won't go into details because it is incredibly graphic, but those are moments in the film that definitely stand out, and you can feel the tribute to Friday the 13th and the Tom Savini era of blood and gore and effects right in these particular moments. Johnny is a gruesome, brutal slasher villain in this movie, and I would not be surprised, given the way this film ends, if we see him again. I wouldn't be surprised. I think there's enough sort of meat on the bones, if you will, to carry this through to another film. Now, would it work again with it being the point of view of Johnny? That I'm not sure, because there is only so much that you can do with a character that doesn't speak. I think if they were to I'm not saying veer completely into the Friday the 13th film, but maybe keep it in that cerebral context, if you will. Again, more of an art house type of slasher film. There might be something there with another film. But again, who knows if that's going to happen? That's just me wildly speculating. There is a moment in the film right near in the third act where it does turn into a more traditional slasher film, where you have the final girl for the film, Chris, being stalked and chased by Johnny, and you do think, okay, we're going to return to formula here, but then it stops, and she is rescued by the woman in the truck, played by Lauren Marie Taylor. And this is where the movie kind of gets the biggest amount of flack. And I have to say, this is where I really had an issue with the film, because I don't mind watching a character walk through the woods. Again, that's the whole point. It's his story. We're watching it through his eyes. I get that. The kills were splattering and they were horrific, gruesome and gratuitous and over the top, and certainly worth the price of admission for these kind of movies. They did not disappoint on those particular moments, but the ending is where it's a mixed bag for me, because after Chris is rescued by the woman in the truck, they're driving supposedly to the hospital, and she goes off on this rather long-winded monologue, and it's about 10 or 15 minutes of the film, where she is talking about how her brother, a game warden, survived an encounter with a bear that mauled him in the woods a number of years before. And you're scratching your head, okay, what's the point here? Was the bear actually Johnny? Is this just some random story? Is it, whatever? Because they never actually have a discussion about why Chris is injured, why she's been running through the woods. But there is sort of this implied implication that, oh, maybe she knows about Johnny. I wasn't sure if maybe the woman was going to be revealed to have a connection to Johnny. Like, there was a lot of what ifs in this particular exchange, and it ultimately doesn't go anywhere other than sort of to state that violent things happen in the woods and there's really nothing you can do about it, but you can survive it. It was definitely a little too long-winded, and it lacked a central end point. There is, however, a moment at the very end of the film. It's like the last 2 minutes. And again, spoiler alert if you haven't seen the film. But the ending of the movie, Chris is bleeding in the truck, and the woman pulls over to fix a tourniquet. And for probably the entire time of this movie, actually, I know it was for the entire time, I actually felt genuine suspense, because everything else that happens in the movie, you're watching it through the point of view of the character. So yeah, the kills are graphic, they're gnarly, but there was no suspense. There was nothing that you might find in a traditional slasher film. This one moment where Chris is looking at the woods and you don't know what's going to happen. Is Johnny going to pop up? Are they going to get away? Is this all a ploy by the woman in the truck? Like, you don't know. And that was the only time I thought, oh my God, what is actually going to happen? I don't know. And I remember saying, okay, this is this gets props here. But then again, the film ends before it can answer those questions completely. So I'm really mixed on this film. I love the idea of subverting the expectations. I like the idea of putting the audience in the point of view of the killer because that's something fresh and unique. But overall, it's the execution of this film. I sort of the injected attempt at commentary about the nature of evil and violent acts. Like there's something there, but it's not thought through enough. And I think that's the strength of, a film even like Friday the 13th, which is not noted necessarily for its great character development or even story points, but there is something about having the spotlight be on the teenage characters, if you will, and having them drive the narrative versus the narrative driving them, that I think works a lot more effectively. I think sometimes when you spotlight these particular slasher villains, the era of mystery sort of leaves them. I think, as an aside, the Rob Zombie Halloween films, where Michael Myers was put, not necessarily like this, but was put much more front and center, and there was an attempt to sort of peel back behind the mask, if you will, carve the pumpkin and see what's inside. And I think these kind of characters are more effective and, frankly, scarier when we know less about them. You sort of take away that mystique and genuine scariness once they're shown front and center, and we're, for a lack of a better word, lack of a better phrase, inside their head. So again, I think there's a lot of interesting ideas going around with this film. I like when we can try to see something different with this particular genre, because the formula is well established, and that is a major plus for this film, that they took the formula and turned it on its head. But it's the overall execution that left me scratching my head and saying, yeah, In a Violent Nature, great idea, but I don't have to see this one again. If you are looking for this essentially to be a Friday the 13th film, to fill the void of the lack of Friday the 13th films in the mainstream, I would honestly say just go watch any of the Friday the 13th films, because while there are moments and there are Easter eggs and there is certainly a definite salute to those films, this leans more into the art house realm, which is, again, not a bad thing, but it does get a little too cerebral. It does get a little too heavy-handed, and I would say if you're just looking for what the Friday the 13th films offer and think this film might be a solution, I would say bypass it and go watch any of those Jason Voorhees films, because this film will likely leave you disappointed. But again, I will say, for fans of the horror genre and slashers in general, definitely check this out, just for the sake of it being an experimental film. And it does at points feel like an experimental film that I think just needed a little bit more finessing to seal the deal, if you will. But that, I think, does it for now. That's all I have to say on In a Violent Nature. Have you seen it? Will you see it? Let me know in the comments below. But that does it for me today. Want to give a little tease for next week's show. It is going to be extraordinary, and I say extraordinary with the letter X emphasized, because I will be talking about the movie Maxine on next week's show. I'll be joined by Anthony Caruso of Tis the Podcast, buddy friend of mine. We also co-host with our friend Chris Evans, DC Unlimited. He'll be joining me next week, and we're going to be talking about the X films, but specifically Maxine, and I am excited. I'm frankly ecstatic to see this film. But that does, of course, for me today. More on Maxine next week, and of course, I'll be back then, and we'll do this all over again for the love of movies.